Okay, I started looking into the sorts of things we're talking about 10 years ago and maybe 15 years ago. Okay, so one of the things that really shocked me, well, there were two things. The first was that when I started looking into the energy and environment nexus in detail, I got more optimistic rather than less. And I thought, oh my God, things are a lot better than I thought they were. People are getting richer at a stunning rate. It looks like there's a positive relationship between population growth and wealth. The planet is cleaner and better off in many ways than it's been for a very long time. Like there's real reasons for optimism. And then I also, so that was shocking. Then I also learned, and this was also shocking, that there's a very positive relationship between GDP and environmental, let's call it awareness and concern. So it looks like once you get people up to about the point where in their country the average GDP is $5,000 per person, people can stop scrabbling around in the dirt and burning everything and eating everything in sight, and they can start to think about what sort of environment they'd like to have for their children and grandchildren.
The technical name is the Kuznets curve, which you probably
right. And so then I thought, oh well, isn't this interesting? What this should mean is that if we wanted to, we could work really hard internationally to make energy cheap, and we could pull billions of people, the remaining people in the world, out of abject poverty. And the consequence of that would be that they would start to become locally concerned about environmental maintainability and sustainability, and then everyone would have enough to eat and they'd all be educated, plus the planet would be better off. And then the question was, okay, and here's a question that we can really delve into. Why the hell aren't we doing this? It's like instead we're buying this crazy apocalyptic narrative that's making the planet worse, that's driving energy costs up, that's destabilizing us sociopolitically, when, as far as I can tell, the pathway forward to abundance and sustainability is pretty damn obvious and also not particularly expensive. So what the hell's going on?
So I quote two folks relevant to this. One is H.L. Mencken, who was a journalist writing in the early part of the 20th century in U.S., very astute, very acerbic. And he's got a line in one of his books, which I'll try to reproduce. The purpose of practical politics is to keep the electorate alarmed by a series of mostly imaginary hobgoblins so that they can be clamoring to be led to safety. And you see the politicians grabbing on to these issues, whether it's the climate, whether it's immigration. They do it on both sides, right? All sides. The missile gap in the 60s. You know, whatever the truth was behind these, the politicians amp it up in order to get the electorate to actually do something, right? So that's one quote. The second is, there was this guy named Anthony Downs, who was an economist working in the 60s through the 90s or 2000s. He was first at UCLA and then at Brookings, so he was quite on the left. He had a number of insights to his credit, but one of them was what he calls the issue attention cycle. Namely, some issue, whether it's pesticides or climate, bubbles among the experts for a while. Nobody pays much attention to it. It suddenly bursts into the public consciousness, and everybody gets both alarmed but also enthusiastic about the ease with which they're going to solve it. Then everybody discovers, boy, this is going to be really hard to solve. And eventually the issue fades with time or morphs into something else.
Yeah.
And I think we are at kind of that third phase now with the climate where everybody is realizing just how hard, and I would say almost impossible, it's going to be to reduce emissions. Certainly net zero by the end of the century looks like it's just not going to happen.
So you know...
And so I think that's what's going on.
Okay, well, I'm going to add some psychological layering to that. You can tell me what you think of this. Well, so first of all, people are tilted towards attention paid to negative events. And so, for example, people are much more hurt by a loss of $5 than they are made happy by a gain of $5. So we're quite loss sensitive. Now, I think the reason we're loss sensitive is that, well, you can only be so happy, but you can be 100% dead. And so being more sensitive to threat in terms of magnitude of response per unit of reinforcement makes sense given that we're finite and vulnerable. And then we also have the problem that any given threat, almost any given threat, could in principle be personally and socially apocalyptic. So, for example, it could be the case that the aches and pains that you're experiencing today are the ground zero for an epidemic that'll kill 1/3 of the United States, right? I mean, it's very unlikely, but it happened with the Black Death. And I mean, the possibility of an apocalyptic outcome is always non-zero. And in fact, in personal life, it's always 100%, because the worst thing that could possibly happen to you will for sure happen to you. And so I think,
eventually happen.
Well, right. And so I think one of our problems is that because we're sensitive to negative information, and because there's always a potential apocalypse bubbling away in the background, it's very hard for us to distinguish collectively between threats that are valid apocalyptically and those that aren't. And then we tend to err on the side of panic, let's say. And that wasn't such a bad thing when our responses weren't as large as the potential problems. Because now what happens is that if we stampede in one direction, we're so powerful that the bloody stampede can be much worse than the problem.